that in 2011 in Ivory Coast, it has been coined as a French UN regime change. Disinformation was also spread by the UN during the post-election crisis. For example, they said that there were mass graves that were found and that were attributed to the Gbagbo government, a fact that the UN then retracted only at the end of the crisis. A UN report in 2012 was so full of factual errors that various intellectuals in the Ivorian diaspora and exile actually responded point by point, providing factual evidence that the allegations were bogus. So a very, very biased position on the part of the UN. What was the role of the United Nations in this specific crisis?
Moreover, another source of tension between the United Nations and Ethiopia was the case, if you remember, that Ethiopia decided to expel 5 important figures of the United Nations from Ethiopia. Ethiopia expelled this UN personnel, accusing them of spreading disinformation, and at the same time, because they, according to the Ethiopian government, these UN personnel were diverting humanitarian aid to the TPLF, and moreover, that they have given some telecommunication devices to the TPLF. And this has further increased the contradiction between the United Nations and the Ethiopian government. In addition to this, related to the UN, is the case of the vehicles which used to transport humanitarian aid to Tigray region. We remember that hundreds of vehicles that were transporting the humanitarian aid to Tigray never returned to Ethiopia. And this has been also a source of contrast between Ethiopia and the United Nations organization. We then later saw that these very vehicles that were used to transport humanitarian aid to Tigray were used by the TPLF to transport fighters, TPLF fighters, into the two regions of AFAR and AMHARA. And lastly, one of the factors that have caused some kind of friction between the United Nations organization and the Ethiopian government was the decision of the UN Council for Human Rights to hold a meeting. You remember there was a meeting, and in this meeting, the focal point of discussion was the violation of human rights in Ethiopia, especially related to the conflict. And the holding of this meeting has been highly contrasted by the Ethiopian government, because before the meeting of the UN Council for Human Rights, there was a joint report by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights. These two organizations said that they have investigated for months, and they produced a joint report regarding the violations of human rights in Tigray. In this report, the two organizations stated that all groups were involved in the Tigrayan conflict were somehow responsible for the violation of human rights. These groups were, in fact, the Ethiopian government and the Eritrean troops, and as well as the TPLF. In spite of the fact that there was this report that was produced by these two groups, that by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the Commission for Human Rights of the United Nations, the UN Council for Human Rights decided to hold the meeting. And in this meeting, it was decided that it would be necessary to form another independent commission that would investigate on the violation of human rights in Ethiopia. All these factors put together have created some kind of contrast and contradiction between the UN and the Ethiopian government. Nowadays, things seem to change, and there seems some kind of improvement in the relations between the Ethiopian government and the United Nations, probably because there is a negotiation that is going on between the Ethiopian federal government and the TPLF.
Ok, donc la relation vraiment n'a pas été idyllique. Dans le cas, par exemple, bon, ils ont quand même été soutenus par des pays comme la Russie ou la Chine au niveau de Conseil de sécurité, mais par exemple, il y a même eu le fait qu'on a chassé 5 membres des Nations Unies. À l'époque, ils ont été chassés du pays parce qu'on les a trouvés qui donnaient soit de l'information technique, du matériel technique, ou ils soutenaient quand même le TPLF, et donc on leur avait demandé de quitter le pays. Mais c'était ça la raison, non? Aussi parce qu'ils faisaient de la fausse information. Comme on l'a vu aussi dans le cas de la Côte d'Ivoire avec les fausses communes, un peu ce genre de fausse information. Mais après, il y a aussi une autre histoire très bizarre, c'est que les véhicules du PAM, donc de l'Agence des Nations Unies pour l'alimentation, ils ont carrément, la chose terrible, c'est que quand ils sont entrés, ils ne sont jamais retournés. Donc, on parle de plus de 400 camions qui sont partis vers le Tigré et qui ont après été utilisés par le TPLF pour faire la guerre. Donc, on voyait que de l'aide humanitaire était détournée dans ce sens-là. Et donc, ça aussi, ça a été dénoncé après par le PAM, mais pas nécessairement au début. Et la chose la plus bizarre, peut-être, c'est qu'il y a eu un rapport qui est sorti en novembre 2020 qui était en rapport avec l'Agence des Nations Unies et une agence des droits de l'homme, l'Agence des droits de l'homme des Nations Unies et une agence éthiopienne des droits de l'homme, et ils avaient fait un rapport qui était arrivé quand même à des conclusions là aussi un peu touchant sur les exactions des deux côtés, ce que moi personnellement j'appelle aussi une forme d'impérialisme, toujours de faux équivalence, selon moi. Ça, c'est moi qui le dis. Mais la chose terrible, c'est que même avec ce rapport qui est sorti, cette organisation des Nations Unies des droits de l'homme a dit non, il faut faire encore une autre investigation, il faut encore insister sur ça, et voilà. Et peut-être maintenant, on va vers une relation meilleure, mais il faudrait voir. Et you want to add something or about the role of the UN? I think
maybe to emphasize that in this case, the role of the UN as an organization, an international organization, and its affiliated organizations such as WFP, the World Food Programme, and also let's not forget WHO, the World Health Organization, have been abysmal. The United Nations is supposed to be neutral and does not interfere in the internal political affairs of countries. But all these norms of international law have been violated, thrown to the wayside, and the UN has been shown, as Sister ASTER has amply enumerated, that it has been meddling in favor of this terrorist group TPLF, whether it is the WFP through its food aid. The US aid has also been complicit in this. They have essentially been feeding the war machine of the TPLF under the guise of famine aid. So a Canadian journalist by the name of Jeff Pierce had gone to Ethiopia and interviewed two UN staff women, one African and the other one I think is Asian. So they confessed to him how their work has been compromised, how some UN staff have been, meddling in the cases of in the internal politics, siding with the TPLF and forcing the UN staff to inflate figures of famine victims in Tigray. Yeah? So if it was, if the estimation, let's say, was that there are 50,000 vulnerable population in Tigray that need food assistance, the UN, through the pressure coming from Geneva, from WHO, some UN staff were forcing them to inflate the figure to say 200,000 or 300,000 population. But by doing this, they would then, send massive food aid, and this food aid would feed the combatants of the TPLF. In fact, many captured TPLF soldiers were found in their pockets with rations clearly designated as USAID energy biscuits, and what have you, which were supposed to go to malnourished children. Huh? But it was the TPLF soldiers who were getting fed by this. So this is typical of what I call feeding the TPLF war machine. The United Nations was complicit in this crime. So was the USAID. So was the WHO. Let's not forget. The head of WHO, the World Health Organization, is one called Dr. Tedros Adhanom, a former TPLF leader who at one time was in Ethiopia the health minister. While he was health minister in Ethiopia, for example, he hid a cholera epidemic that was happening in Ethiopia at that time. I think it was around 2005, and pressured the health officers in Ethiopia to call it, instead of cholera, acute watery diarrhea. Why? So that his regime would benefit from tourism. If it's a case of cholera epidemic, the number of tourists visiting Ethiopia would decline, right? So this notorious guy in 2017 becomes the Director General of World Health Organization. As World Health Organization Director, he's not supposed to meddle in internal political affairs of countries, because the internal rules and regulations of United Nations prohibit the bureaucrats, the UN staff, from involving themselves in political affairs of nations. But Tedros Adhanom was notorious in meddling in Ethiopian case, in this case, siding with his TPLF buddies and giving them all kind of help, pressuring UN staff in Ethiopia to do all kinds of things. So to emphasize, the United Nations has been so thoroughly compromised, and its role has been so shameful. They've been trying to manufacture crisis. They brought the case of Ethiopia 10 times to the UN Security Council, but thanks to Russia, to China, and a few other countries, India, they could not pass any resolution against Ethiopia or Eritrea, because the Russians and Chinese were wiser this time around. Remember, in 2011, they were fooled. So they were saying, yeah, you fool us once, shame on you, but you fool us twice, it will be shame on us. So they were alert, and thankfully they prevented, they used their no vote. If these two countries vote no, it becomes a veto. Huh? So the United States and the European allies could not pass the resolution against Ethiopia that they wanted. So they resorted then to unilateral sanctions measure. So the United States has put sanctions on Eritrea. It is now also threatening through a congressional resolution, which is still at the committee level, HR 6600, it's called, House resolution. And it threatens sanction on Ethiopia and Eritrea to be intensified. So it's this kind of things. The UN has been complicit and has been a tool, essentially, of the United States and Western governments in this war, openly siding with the TPLF.
Donc, on peut dire vraiment que les Nations Unies ont vraiment pris parti dans cette guerre aux côtés de TPLF. On peut le voir à travers toutes les agences, hein, donc le PAM, l'Organisation mondiale de la santé et dans ce cas, USAID aussi, l'agence, bon, ça c'est une agence américaine et ils ont, il y a par exemple un journaliste canadien qui s'appelle Jeff Pierce qui a fait un bon travail. Il a interviewé des membres des Nations Unies qui ont vraiment parlé de l'ingérence, de comment on leur mettait de la pression, de dire certaines choses, ils n'étaient pas libres et ils ont vraiment parlé de leur difficulté de travailler dans une manière neutrale, ce qu'ils devraient faire en théorie.
And by the way, these two courageous women, UN staff in Ethiopia, are now punished for whistleblowing and they are suspended from their jobs. Because they told the truth. They exposed the dirty dealings of the United Nations.
Et donc, ces deux dames, aujourd'hui, ils ont même été suspendus des Nations Unies pour avoir parlé et dit la vérité de ce qui se passait, au lieu d'avoir que quelqu'un les prend. Non, et donc, il y a quand même, par exemple, une autre chose qu'on fait beaucoup, c'est de gonfler les numéros. Et Elias AMARE nous souligne quand même que pour lui, c'est une manière de nourrir la guerre, non? Parce que on dit par exemple qu'il y a, au lieu de 50 000, on dit qu'il y a 200 000 personnes qui ont besoin d'aide humanitaire et cette aide vient après détecter et cette aide va vers le TPLF au lieu d'aller vers les gens qui en ont vraiment besoin. C'est une manière aussi d'alimenter la guerre. Et la chose la plus terrible de tout, c'est que le chef de l'OMS aujourd'hui, Tedros, donc, qui suit encore l'histoire, ça c'est moi, c'est pas Elias qui dit ça, qui suit encore l'histoire du Covid est malade parce que dans le sens qu'il faut voir que ça aussi c'est une arnaque, l'histoire du Covid, parce qu'on a à la tête aujourd'hui de l'Organisation mondiale de la santé quelqu'un comme Tedros qui quand même était un ministre de la santé en Éthiopie, et quand il était ministre, il avait même caché en 2005 au monde qu'il y avait une grave crise de choléra dans le pays, et il avait fait semblant qu'il n'y en avait pas. Pourquoi? Parce qu'il voulait quand même que le tourisme continue à arriver. Donc, il avait dit, ah non, c'est juste un problème de diarrhée, un petit problème de... Il avait carrément caché ça. Donc, ça, c'est la personne qui maintenant est à la tête de l'Organisation mondiale de la santé. Et donc, lui aussi, par exemple, il n'a pas du tout dénoncé toutes les exactions dans les autres régions des hôpitaux et tout ça, mais il a juste parlé et pris le côté du TPLF, ce qu'un membre des Nations Unies ne devrait pas faire, parce qu'il devrait quand même avoir un rôle neutre. Donc, les Nations Unies, dans ce cas, ont été très compromis, vraiment très, très compromis, et plus ou moins, c'est ça que j'ai couvert. Et on parlait aussi du fait que que pratiquement on a même cherché de faire une résolution, donc on a amené 10 fois la crise au Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies, mais cette fois-ci la Russie et l'Inde, ou bien la Russie quand même et la Chine ont mis le veto là-dessus, parce qu'ils se sont dit, bon, on a été trompé déjà pour la Libye en 2011, et là maintenant on ne va pas répéter la même erreur. Et donc heureusement que ces résolutions-là ont été stoppées, mais quand même c'est pour ça qu'ils ont maintenant fait des sanctions unilatérales, parce qu'ils n'ont pas pu les faire à travers les Nations Unies, mais quand même un rôle très très néfaste.
Just to add a point that I forgot, by the way, this abuse of food aid as a political weapon is a long-standing tradition of the TPLF. During its days as rebels fighting against the Mengistu regime, I remember in 1984 was a terrible famine in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. During this time, the TPLF had used famine aid to advance its own political end. It was later exposed by the BBC, for example. Surprisingly, Martin Plaut wrote about it in BBC. If you Google search Martin Plaut, TPLF, food aid, you will find this article. It was written around 2010. So it is estimated that $100 million were the TPLF managed to get through food aid, and it only gave from this to the people of Tigray, to the starving famine victims, only $5 million. The rest, it used it to strengthen its organization and to buy weapons and what have you, 95 million. This was witnessed by one former leader of the TPLF, Aragawi Berhe, Dr. Aragawi Berhe, who later fell, from grace and was expelled from the TPLF and went to the West. He's now, I think, back in Ethiopia. But he gave witness to this story that the TPLF had abused food aid and the famine to siphon off the money, the charity coming, and it's almost stole like 95 million coming. This was supposed to go to the famine victims, but only a tiny percentage, 5% of this money or this food aid went to the famine victims. The rest went into strengthening the TPLF. This is how the TPLF strengthened itself, and when it came to power in 1991, it already had accumulated this amount of money in its war chest.
Donc, pour dire que déjà aussi dans la guerre contre Mengistu, eux, le TPLF, avait déjà à l'époque s'approprié de l'argent qui était carrément pour les gens en famine, pour renforcer, même pour acheter des armes, pour se renforcer. Et là, on a même carrément un monsieur qui vient de l'interne du TPLF, qui s'appelle Aragawi Bere, qui aujourd'hui est dans l'Occident, qui a quand même dénoncé tout ça parce qu'aujourd'hui, il ne travaille plus avec eux. Et donc, eux, et il y a même un de nos personnages là qui aujourd'hui a vendu le Plaut, le Martin Plaut, qui à l'époque quand même, parce que il y a des décennies, il avait écrit sur ça. Donc, il devrait connaître la vraie nature de ce régime du TPLF, même si aujourd'hui il écrit autre chose. And thank you. Now we just move on to some of the last questions, which now a big question that we have is, for example, the costs of this war. We saw that, I read you before, that the cost of the war in Ivory Coast was huge, tremendous, with the sanctions and the loss of a lot of war. I asked Aster, what is the cost of the war that we know so far? And we also know that the war is actually ongoing, that despite the fact that the government of Abiy Ahmed says that the war is over officially, there's one question I don't understand why he's not protecting some of the areas, because it seems to me like the war is ongoing. And what is happening, what are the costs that we know so far, and what is happening today? Because if the war has not finished, why has the government declared that it's over, when it is declaring, however, that the TPLF is still occupying the regions of AFAR and AMHARA? I saw that from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs the other day. The costs in general.
And I would like to divide the talk in two phases. The first phase was what we have been speaking earlier. That is, the first phase is the Ethiopian federal forces waged the war against the TPLF and were able to reoccupy Mekelle within a period of 3 weeks. The second phase was, if you remember, the Ethiopian government made a unilateral ceasefire, decided to have a unilateral ceasefire. I think, if I remember well, it was around June. And after the Ethiopian government on a unilateral basis decided to stop the war against the TPLF forces started attacking the two regions confining Tigray. They are the AFAR and the AMHARA region. it was really a very devastating war, and it was really, I would call it a unique type of war because it was a mass invasion. The TPLF arrived in these two regions, bringing hundreds and thousands of people. Most of the fighters of the TPLF, maybe not the majority, a part of the TPLF forces were composed of young people of the age of 12, 13, and 14. And the AMHARA special forces, the militia, and the federal forces, the same thing in AFAR, had to fight against people who were underage, as I mentioned before. And also, in this mass invasion, there were even old people of 70 and 80 years old. So it's a very specific kind of war that was waged against the two regions. And the effect of this second phase war was really devastating on the social and economic life of the AMHARA and the AFAR people. It has completely destroyed a number of hospitals, clinics, health centers, small and big businesses, private homes, pharmacies, universities have been totally devastated. And moreover, we have numbers, we have figures, but these figures, for me, they are highly underestimated. Because as you mentioned before, the war is still going on. The Ethiopian government says that the conflict has stopped, but the war is going on in the Afar and Amhara region. So the number of devastation and the number of days and the economic impact of this war will be increasing in the future. Some months ago, the AFAR administration declared that the TPLF destroyed around 60 medical centers and hospitals. The situation is even worse in the Amhara region. Thousands of schools, health centers, hospitals, universities have been totally destroyed. Moreover, there was a number of looting. The TPLF forces looted, for example, computers, technological devices from the universities and the schools. The farmers, ordinary farmers, Amhara farmers, and Afar farmers were looted of their agricultural products. The TPLF forces slaughtered tens and hundreds of domestic animals, some of them like the cows and sheep, goats. In Afar, they slaughtered camels. In Amhara region, they slaughtered donkeys. Not only some of these animals were like cows and sheep were eaten, were used for eating by the TPLF forces. But the strangest thing that happened, especially in the Amhara region, was that TPLF forces deliberately killed the animals without eating them. And this is really the strangest thing that one could witness in a war. They were simply killed because the ownership of these animals, the owners of these animals are Amharas. So even the killing of animals had an ethnic significance. Hence, the devastation is really incredible. Some time ago, the Amhara administration declared that the economic, the amount of economic devastation in Amhara reached around 5.7 billion American dollars. So, as I said before, I think even these estimates are going to increase in the future because the war is still going on. And recently, an AFAR activist said that In AFAR, we have around 700,000 internally displaced people. In AMHARA, there are around, I don't know, 1 million, 3 up 2 million people displaced in the AMHARA region. Recently, as we said, that the war is going on, and within a few weeks, around 300,000 AFAR people have been displaced. The TPLF has occupied around 5 waradas. Waradas are small administrative units. And in Amhara region, as was mentioned before, the TPLF is still present in Raya, in some zones, in some territories of Raya. For example, the TPLF is present in Adberkai, in Maitsamri, in a city called Forum, and it's trying to extend its aggression on a city a new city known as Popo. Recently, we have around 13,000 Raya people who have escaped the war that's being waged by the TPLF, and they are found now in the near city of Popo. Hence, the war is continuing, the damage is continuing. And the TPLF, for example, in the Afar region, destroyed water wells, so that, and this has created a shortage of drinking water in the Afar region. And the war is still continuing, and the damage will be, I think, if the Ethiopian government doesn't decide to stop the military advance of the TPLF, the devastation in the future will be even more than what we have been describing now.
Ok, donc on a parlé des coûts de la guerre et la guerre qui malheureusement continue en ces jours-ci. Donc la chose terrible, c'est que on n'a pas vu, il y a eu deux phases. Donc il y a eu la première phase qui s'est arrêtée quand il y a eu quand même le cessez-le-feu unilatéral en juin 2020. Mais tout après, le TPLF n'a pas respecté ce cessez-le-feu. Et donc, ils ont commencé à attaquer la région AFAR et AMHARA. Et là, ils ont même pris des enfants, vraiment des gamins de 12, 13 ans et des vieillards qu'ils ont pris pour les recruter pour faire cette guerre. Ils les mettaient un peu devant, non, comme des boucs, comment on peut les appeler en français, les gens qui en mettent devant, comme des
chairs à canon.
Voilà, des chairs à canon. Et ils ont vraiment... c'est une deuxième qui est devenue encore plus terrible, aussi parce qu'il n'y a pas le gouvernement en ce moment qui est en train de les protéger. Et la chose qu'on ne comprend pas aussi, c'est la nécessité, à part avoir vraiment détruit des hôpitaux, plus de 7000 entre centre, hôpital et toutes les écoles, mais ils ont aussi tout pris, tout cassé, comme vous voyez dans les images aussi. Ça, c'est les deux régions de AFAR et AMHARA. Et on a vraiment tout cassé. Et la chose qu'on ne comprend pas, c'est aussi la nécessité de tuer les animaux, qui ont été mangés, de les laisser comme ça seulement parce que c'était des animaux qui étaient des AMHARA. Et ça n'a vraiment aucune... Pour vous donner aussi une idée de la gravité de la situation, on a quand même 700 000 déplacés internes dans la région de Afar et 2 millions dans la région de AMHARA. Et donc, vraiment des chiffres très, très hauts de déplacés internes. Et juste dernièrement, il y a encore eu 300 000 qui sont déplacés d'une autre région parce qu'ils ont occupé des centres administratifs qui s'appellent les Woreda. Donc, en ce moment aussi, il y a vraiment beaucoup d'escapés encore et la guerre est en train de continuer. Donc, on dit que ça s'est arrêté, mais ce n'est pas le cas. And I don't know. Oh, yes. My question for Elia here was Ivory Coast under President Gbagbo was targeted also because of the autonomy of its financial management, known as secure budget management, namely to run the country only with its own revenue. President Gbagbo had decided not to borrow money from agencies such as the IMF and the World Bank. Eritrea has been scapegoated for decades and is also carrying a heavy cost in this war. Can you speak of, just very briefly, of the long war of independence fought basically alone, with little help from other countries, and the recent US sanctions imposed on the Eritrean government, which seem to be even harsher than the ones imposed on Ethiopia?
Yes, for many years during its liberation struggle and afterwards, Eritrea has been practicing self-reliance, rejecting foreign aid, rejecting this NGOs, charity handouts, dependency, and building the nation from the ground up through its own resources, focusing on agriculture, ensuring food security, building dams, and also to some extent agro industry, which will then kick into industrialization. So it has been careful in rejecting foreign aid, as I said, and rejecting the IMF, World Bank diktat, as Gbagbo had done in Cote d'Ivoire. And this is amply recorded. And it's for this, I think, that the West, especially imperialism, doesn't like this. Neocolonialism does not like this. Because if Africa starts to practice this all over, Africa will be free of aid dependency. So, development will start, agriculture, industrialization will take place in Africa. So this kind of example has to be crushed before it spreads elsewhere. That's why we have had, for 60 years almost now since independence, neocolonialism has been foisted, imposed on Africa, punishing leaders that are visionary, that want to have an independent economic, political line, real, genuine development. And so because of this, Eritrea was invaded by the TPLF regime in 1998. A war was ignited against it under the border context, pretext. And then later sanctions were imposed on it, economic warfare essentially, to effect regime change, to bring down the government. But the people rallied behind the government, and still standing. Eritrea still standing tall on its feet. It has not, succumbed. It has not been overthrown. On the contrary, it was the TPLF regime which had been so totally dependent on foreign aid, Western aid, that finally was overthrown. Ethiopia, under the reformist government of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, also was beginning some moves towards independence, economic independence, to produce its own wheat, for example. Experiments which have been promising, so that it can be free from being dependent on foreign food aid. And I think this kind of thing, the West doesn't like that. And that's all this thing you're seeing, the devastation of war that you're seeing in Ethiopia now, is because of this. Because in the new Horn of Africa that is emerging, even in Somalia, this away from war, away from this vicious cycle of conflicts, if these countries begin to cooperate and begin to depend on their own resources to feed themselves. Ethiopia, for example, has huge potential of agriculture. If it starts to harness, like the GERD, the new Renaissance dam that it has done, it will provide electricity for 45 million of its population. So industrialization will begin to take place. Ethiopia can become an economic powerhouse of the region. And if this kind of thing takes all over Africa, spreads in West Africa and Cote d'Ivoire, if Nigeria becomes free from corruption and begins really to develop itself and becomes an economic powerhouse. Well, the West will not like that. That's why you see all these wars in the Horn of Africa. At the end of the day, the explanation of it is they're using the West, the United States and the Europeans are using TPLF to destabilize the whole region, to prevent it from emerging, from ensuring genuine economic development, from being free from foreign aid, from dependency, and embarking on the path of real economic development, which is what? Agricultural, food security, self-sufficiency, agro-industry, and then industrialization. Once this kind of thing takes place all over Africa, it's game over for imperialism, for neocolonialism. On top of that, China is also, expanding in its engagement with Africa, which is, I view it as very positive. It is unlike that of the West, which has for the past 60 years of neocolonialism kept Africa under poverty. China, if managed properly, it's a win-win situation for both African countries and for China itself. And China is emerging as a global economic power. So under such circumstances, we witness then these sanctions, economic warfare, war by proxy imposed, and this devastation that ASTER has enumerated. I mean, the devastation of war has been tremendous. It will take years, of course. But what is the option for Ethiopia? To go back to the days of the dark days of TPLF, minority rule? No Ethiopian will accept that. That is impossible. The TPLF is hell-bent in saying "après nous le déluge," as they say in French, right?
Yes.
If we cannot rule, we will destroy Ethiopia. They have openly said this. Their spokesman Getachew Reda is on record saying we will go to the depth of hell to destroy Ethiopia if we cannot go back to power in Addis Ababa. So you see this vindictive group, terrorist group TPLF, unleashing massive destruction in AMHARA region, in AFAR region, destroying infrastructure, hospitals, schools, industries, factories, and what have you. That is the TPLF. And it is this notorious, destructive group that is being supported by the West to prevent the new Horn of Africa from emerging. The era of peace and cooperation and development from finally emerging in the Horn of Africa. You have to remember, the Horn of Africa has been the most conflict and war-devastated region for the past 80 years in Africa. We have been having these vicious cycles of conflict that are constantly pushed by Western powers. Once we say no more, enough, and a new era of peace and stability and cooperation begins, the sky is the limit for our development. And this example then will be replicated elsewhere in Africa. So you see what you see now, these sanctions, economic warfare, destabilization, attempts at human rights intervention, and what have you. But the peoples of our region have had enough. They are saying no more. I think that the new movement, Pan-Africanist movement that has begun in the Horn of Africa, and Ethiopia and Eritrea now is spreading elsewhere. No more is becoming a Pan-Africanist movement. People are saying in Mali, pas plus, right? That's how we say no more in French. Am I correct? Is it pas
Yes.
plus? Yeah. No more. We're fed up, tired of neocolonialism. We will no longer become, impoverished, and we want to free ourselves. We want to develop ourselves. That's what
Yes.
Africa is saying. I think this is the new vision that the new generation, young generation of
Yes.
Africans must take up as a rallying cry. A new period of Pan-Africanist renaissance and resurgence, I think, in my opinion.
Yes. Donc, je traduis que pratiquement, bon, les sanctions, heureusement, ceux des Nations Unies ont été stoppés, comme on avait discuté, parce qu'il y a quand même la Russie et la Chine qui ont stoppé les sanctions des Nations Unies. Il y a eu quand même des sanctions unilatérales de la part des Nations Unies vis-à-vis de l'Éthiopie, mais encore pire vis-à-vis de l'Érythrée. Parce que vraiment, ils ont beaucoup sanctionné carrément tout le gouvernement, aussi toutes les industries, leurs moyens de paiement, et vraiment, ils ont beaucoup sanctionné l'Érythrée. Mais comme c'est un pays qui est très habitué déjà à vivre parce qu'ils ont fait une très longue lutte d'indépendance et ils dépendent que d'eux-mêmes, ils sont vraiment habitués à ce genre de sanctions et d'être complètement de dépendre complètement de leurs propres ressources. Mais ils se sont aussi ouverts maintenant à la Chine avec l'initiative Belt Road Initiative. Donc, ça, et aussi d'avoir des sources alternatives d'échange. Et ça, c'est intéressant parce que c'est vraiment un monde multipolaire qui va naître au lieu d'avoir cette monde des dernières 3 décennies qu'on a vu après l'écroulement de l'Union soviétique, où on voit vraiment, où on a vu l'hégémonie totale des États-Unis ou quand même de l'Occident. Et par contre, Elias Amare prévoit quand même que ce monde-là est en train de s'écrouler et qu'on va plutôt vers un monde de coopération
Très bien.
Aller au-delà vraiment du colonialisme.
Donc, venons sur notre chaîne de NTV dans l'émission Tannery. Donc, voilà, on peut embrayer sur le mouvement No More, le mouvement, il peut en parler, l'impact et après le mot de fin à Elias et à Aster.
Just 2 more questions then, if maybe you want to speak about the No More movement and its effective mobilization. Just one example, which I thought was quite extraordinary, is that the Ethiopian diaspora in Virginia, US, recently voted in a Republican candidate in protest against the Biden administration. Diplomacy towards Ethiopian crisis. I don't know if you could tell us something about this No More movement and what it has achieved. Please, Aster.
In the struggle to contain the extensive propaganda that was launched by the TPLF regarding the Ethiopian government and the Ethiopian people in general, I think the most important role was played by the Ethiopian diaspora. And in relation to this, I think the No More movement has had a significant role. And it's because of the No More movement that we have seen some kind of change at the international level regarding the image of Ethiopia. And it has helped also to show the political nature of TPLF and to expose the criminal activities and the crimes that it has committed, especially in the AFAR and AMHARA region. Hence, the No More movement has been important. I hope it will continue, but I'm very skeptical because the political situation in Ethiopia, I think, is not very favorable for the continuing of the No More movement.
Ok, donc le mouvement de No More a été un mouvement incroyable, beaucoup soutenu par c'était vraiment soutenu par la diaspora qui a fait vraiment des manifestations qui allaient de tout, de Washington à vraiment c'était à Rome, partout il y avait vraiment des manifestations énormes qui ont soutenu. Qui était soutenu vraiment par la diaspora, cet mouvement-là, et qui ont vraiment contrasté ce qui était la propagande qu'ils ont dû subir. Mais voilà, le seul problème, c'est ils ont vraiment montré toutes les activités criminelles qu'on ne montrait pas du TPLF, et on doit dire que vraiment aussi dénoncer beaucoup le rôle des médias. Mais Aster nous dit qu'elle est un peu sceptique que, parce que la situation en ce moment ne va pas bien dans le pays, et elle est un peu sceptique est-ce que ça va vraiment pouvoir continuer cette hashtag no more, parce que en ce moment on comprend pas pourquoi voilà on pousse pas vraiment pour une continuation dans cet élan là. Donc on a peur peut-être d'en retomber en quelque sorte du régime peut-être dans les vieux schémas. Ça on peut pas savoir. And maybe for Elias, AMARE, I maybe ask you, what steps should be taken to reinforce a Pan-African diplomacy?
It has to be a people's movement from the bottom up, not imposed from top down. Real Pan-Africanism must be Pan-Africanism of the African peoples, whether they are in Cote d'Ivoire, in Mali, Eritrea, in Ethiopia, in Somalia, in Zimbabwe. A new resurgence of this no more movement has great potential, I think, in pushing the leaders to be more assertive, to defend the sovereignties of African nations, and to start afresh. In this regard, the recent African Union meeting, the 35th session that was recently held in Addis Ababa, passed important resolutions against these unilateral sanctions that are imposed on African countries. This is unprecedented. For example, it was not done when Eritrea was sanctioned or when Libya was being invaded in 2011. So this is a new beginning, a tentative steps. And I think this grassroots movement, people connecting from east to west, and also the global diaspora, African diaspora, let's not forget. We have a huge population in the West, whether it's from West Africa, from East Africa, that are now citizens in the West. So the No More movement, for example, galvanized Ethiopian and Eritrean voters in the United States. I mean, they're citizens, American citizens, but originally from Eritrea or Ethiopia, and they came together, voted as a bloc to prevent, for example, the Democrats from winning in Virginia. It made a significant difference, I can tell you that. The margin by which the Democrats lost in the governorship race last a few months ago was 80,000. And combined together, Eritreans and Ethiopian voters in Virginia make up over 100,000. So they rallied, and that made a difference. And we can do it in these upcoming elections, in November, in midterm elections. It is the Democrats now who are becoming warmongers. The Democrats occupying the White House and the State Department. This what I would call the liberal imperialists or neoliberals or what have you. Left, right, oftentimes does not make much sense to me in the United States. It's a duopoly. They're essentially the same side. There's two sides of the same coin. But we have to stand up. We have to say you cannot devastate our ancestral homelands with these terrible wars and economic warfare and sanction. And we can do it. We have proven we can do it. If we organize, if we mobilize, massive demonstrations, and as a result of this mobilization, also a popular movement is growing. Other African diaspora immigrants can join. I think we need to talk to each other, learn from each other's experience, and make sure that this popular grassroots movement spreads all over Africa, because it is resonating with the young generation of Africans. They're tired. I can feel it. I hear them on the social media, what they're speaking, what they're saying. They're sharing experiences, and they're raising this rallying cry: enough of neocolonialism. And I think it is doable. I am more of an optimist in that regard. I echo the sentiment once echoed by Antonio Gramsci. I learned this from Edward Said, the great Palestinian activist. He was quoting Gramsci, and he say, "By intellect, I am pessimist. By the will, I am optimist." Okay, so we have to be pessimist by the intellect, but optimist by the will. Yes, we see there are a lot of problems. There are obstacles and impediments. Intellectually, when we analyze situation, oftentimes it leads us to pessimism or skepticism. But I must caution my sister Aster. We have to be also, as people engaged in the struggle, we have to be by the will optimists to see that another world is possible. That a better world can be ushered in, and through struggle, there is a way forward. I think it is not a dead end. It's not completely lost cause, but the potential for change is there in Africa, and it is this kind of exchange of ideas between East and West, between North and South Africa, that will usher in a resurgence of Pan-Africanism spirit that was there in the 1960s by the founding fathers like Kwame Nkrumah, like Julius Nyerere, the visionary leaders, Frantz Fanon. The new generation of Africans must reread Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, especially that chapter 3, Pitfalls of Nationalism, what it talks about the dangers of tribalism, of ethnic division, sectarian division, that neocolonialism tries to play to divide us. Divide and conquer is the name of the game for the imperialists, for the neocolonials. So we must be united. We must narrow down the sectarian ethnic divides that there are. These are superficial. They are artificial, actually. And imagine a new Africa, a new Pan-African spirit, I think.
Yes, we're just a bit worried. I mean, I am, when I see that maybe they're not defending now why is the Abiy government not defending the AFAR and AMHARA regions with militarily, because the people are currently being massacred. That is not very clear, and so maybe my
answer to that is very simple. Remember, the TPLF regime was brought down by massive popular uprising in Ethiopia, beginning by young people in 2015. Many people lost their lives, of course, thousands, but eventually the unthinkable happened, and the TPLF regime crumpled like dust in 2018. So governments have to be pushed by popular mobilization from below, and we can do it. It has been done before. It can be done again.
Actually, I would like to discuss the internal political situation in Ethiopia, because it is so complicated. We don't have the problem of TPLF only, as you know, my brother. We have also other forces like OLF Shene. In these days, a number of people are dying around Ethiopia. Just recently, a number of people are being killed in the region of Oromia, and that's not the responsibility of TPLF. That's the responsibility of OLF Shene. The situation in Ethiopia is getting much more complicated. It's not easy. We cannot simply accuse the TPLF. The ethnic politics in Ethiopia is creating a devastating situation, actually. 2 days ago, around 30 people were killed in Oromia. Every day we hear that people are being massacred in Oromia. And this is an ethnically based killing. And this has been going on for the last 3-4 years. We cannot hide anymore the situation in Ethiopia. The internal factors, the internal contradictions of Ethiopia are going to affect even the diplomatic activity and even the no more movement. If you see now, the Ethiopian diaspora is no more participating in the no more movement. And that's because there are some political factors, internal political factors that are hindering the movement to go ahead. The situation, I think it might take, I don't know, 2-3 hours to discuss the political situation in Ethiopia now. It's getting worse and worse every day.
That's why I think we should have another program. This was mainly one to introduce to our West African public the possibility to understand who the actors are, what has happened, how the implications were in the West. And I also want to be optimistic. I can feel it that this is going to be definitely the liberation, the century of Africa's liberation, I'm sure. Because I can feel what's happening in West Africa. The youth has understood. I totally agree with ELIAS AMARE that it's over. It's just going to take this last push. But at the same time, we also have to not forget what is happening on a daily basis, and also be ready to criticize if something is.
Excuse me, Nicoleta, the question in Ethiopia now, it has become a question of survival. The situation now is a question of survival for the AFAR and the AMHARA people. Yes. The war has not stopped. The war is going on in the AFAR region. People are dying there. People are being displaced. The same thing is happening in the AMHARA region, especially in the territories of Raya. People are being killed every day in Oromia. We hear, every day we hear that 30, 40 people are killed, especially in Oromia, especially in the province of Wallagga. And this is the situation in Ethiopia now. And the government doesn't take any kind of decision. The armed forces are ordered not to retaliate to TPLF. In fact, the government has declared that there is no conflict in Ethiopia, but the conflict is going on, and people are dying, and people are being displaced. So it's a question of survival.
Yeah. What would be the best thing that we could do now, considering that we have so far sort of been very positive and optimist about the Abiy Ahmed government? What would be the best thing to do to start denouncing these? What would you say?
Ethiopians have started denouncing yesterday. I don't know, you have seen the video. I've seen the video. The AFARs and the AMHARAs have been demonstrating yesterday in front of the State Department. And they were condemning openly the government of Abiy Ahmed. Things are changing.
What do you think, Elias? What can we do?
As Aster said, I'm not denying the internal contradictions are so complex. The 3 decades of the legacy of the TPLF is not going to be healed overnight. It will take time. These are, I believe, the last gasps of a dying regime or its legacy. The toxic legacy of ethnic politics will take some time to completely heal. And I think this Ethiopia is a very big, complex country facing complex problems. But I think the potential is there once the TPLF is completely gone from the scene for a new beginning, a new imagination. I'm hopeful, for example, of the upcoming national dialogue. If a genuine national dialogue of reconciliation starts, the people can come up with solutions. And I think from all corners of Ethiopia, there is fatigue from this toxic ethnic politics. They want a new kind of beginning. What that new kind is going to be, I think will be decided in the future. So the struggle has to intensify. I agree the problems facing the country are not simple. They're very complex problems. We cannot deny that. But imaginative solutions are also possible. Governments usually have to be pushed to bring about change. Fundamental changes always happen from bottom up, from grassroots movements, popular mobilization. I think that in the next stage, that kind of a popular mobilization is much needed. Yes, people are suffering in AFAR and AMHARA. The war has not been over yet. I mean, still fighting remains to be done. The pressure from the West is there. But I don't think the TPLF can come back to power. And I don't think the toxic ethnic politics of the TPLF has, the Ethiopian people do not have stomach for it. They want a new dispensation, respect, mutual respect, of course, plurality, but, democratic beginnings are in the offing. I mean, I may be too optimistic, but that's how I feel. That's how I see it from Eritrea. But then again, in internal Ethiopian matters, I acknowledge that my sister ASTER could be more knowledgeable than me. Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but what option do I have but to be optimistic for the new beginning?
Thanks.
And I think that's a very nice.
Let's be optimistic.
I like that. Je vais traduire donc.
Let's finish it with optimism.
Yes.
And say la luta continua. The struggle continues.
La luta continua. Et donc, on avait juste abordé le fait qu'il y a en ce moment quand même des exactions qui continuent et c'est pas nécessairement que le TPLF, mais aussi, par exemple, le OLF qui est dans certaines régions. Donc, justement, ASTER posait la question, mais comment c'est possible que le gouvernement ne protège pas les deux régions et qu'on fait semblant que c'est que le TPLF, il y a aussi d'autres, un groupe, des miliciens Oromo qui sont en train d'attaquer les AMHARA en particulier. Et donc, il faut aussi parler de tout ça. Le fait que le président actuel n'en parle pas, c'est assez grave. Par contre, Elias AMARE, qui vient de l'Érythrée, qui a quand même 70 ans d'une lutte incroyable qu'ils ont fait pour l'indépendance et pour la souveraineté. On va traduire après mieux ce qu'il nous a dit. Donc lui, il nous cite les mots magnifiques de Antonio Gramsci qui disait voilà qu'il faut être pessimiste dans l'intellect, mais quand même optimiste dans la volonté. Et avec ces mots-là, mes amis, on va vous laisser. C'était vraiment une magnifique soirée. Je vous remercie beaucoup de nous avoir écoutés. On va faire une traduction plus précise peut-être de certains morceaux parce que ça a été très improvisé. Et je vous remercie beaucoup pour l'attention.
Ok, donc je voulais rajouter que c'est vrai que c'est vrai, je voulais aussi dire que la soirée a été longue. On a voulu consacrer vraiment beaucoup de temps à l'histoire de l'Éthiopie, de l'Érythrée et du Tigré, parce que les gens de l'ouest de l'Afrique n'ont pas d'infos là-dessus et c'est pour ça que la soirée a été très longue. Moi, je remercie nos invités, Elias AMARE et ASTER. Je vous remercie beaucoup d'avoir participé, d'avoir pris le temps de participer à cette émission. Et cette émission vraiment a pour but de faire le lien entre l'Afrique de l'Ouest et l'Afrique de l'Est. Et la jeunesse le demande, la jeunesse africaine toute réunie le demande. Maintenant, ils sont ensemble. Et donc, nous, on prend le parti de vraiment relier ces deux parties, sans oublier aussi les pays comme le Burundi, le Rwanda, le Swahili et tous ces pays-là. Et donc, on aura des émissions maintenant comme ça. C'est long parce que c'est en deux langues. Il y a la traduction, il y a les thèmes. Donc, je vous remercie beaucoup d'avoir consacré toute la journée pour Elias et tout l'après-midi, toute la soirée pour Aster. Et donc, sur 2NTV, dans l'émission Tamiri, on vous remercie et on espère vous revoir et à très bientôt.
We hope to see you soon again, and we know the
Thank you
youth.
so much.
Yes.
The youth really wants a lot to hear these type of programs, and so we really thank you, and we hope you'll be coming back soon.
OK.
Thank you so much. I think it's a good night.
Dans
I
une
don't know
émission
for
plus courte,
Elias.
hein.
What
Vous
time
venez dans
is
une
it
émission
over
plus
there?
Merci.
Elias,
Yes,
what time is
Aster.
it over there? Your
We will
time.
continue the discussion. I'm
Yeah,
glad
yeah,
we
yeah.
had this
It's going to
discussion.
be very interesting.
Very interesting
Merci
indeed.
encore. Merci
But
beaucoup.
grazie. Thank you.
Grazie
Thank you
mille.
also. Bye bye. Ciao.